Olá, começa agora mais uma transmissão ao vivo de Tutameia, sempre trazendo para você uma personagem, uma figura que nos ajude a compreender melhor o Brasil, o mundo, né? Para que a gente possa atuar melhor, trabalhar melhor nessa nossa pátria tão querida, né?
Ele é o Rodolfo.
Ela é a Eleonora, e ele é o nosso convidado especialíssimo de hoje, na primeira sessão de entrevistas internacionais do Tutameia aqui no Brasil, né? A gente fez uma no início do ano. Walden Bello, das Filipinas, que é um ativista da democracia há mais de 50 anos. Ele vai ser mais detalhadamente apresentado aqui pela Eleonora. Antes disso, eu quero te convidar para participar dessa nossa entrevista, não só mandando seus comentários, mas ajudando a levar mais longe essa interpretação, esse debate que a gente faz aqui, divulgando nas redes sociais, compartilhando entre seus amigos. Todo esse material vai ficar disponível no nosso canal de vídeo, youtube.com/c/Eleonora e Rodolfo Lucena, Tutameia. O Tutameia é escrito com letras maiúsculas. E todo esse trabalho fica ancorado no nosso site, tutameia.jor.br. Eleonora.
Walden Bello, muito obrigada por estar aqui conosco hoje. Very welcome here. Walden Bello tem uma... Bom, tem que colar aqui, porque é muita coisa para falar. Sociólogo, professor da Universidade Estadual de Nova York, foi parlamentar nas Filipinas, recebeu o Nobel Alternativo em 2003, doutor por Universidade de Princeton, foi professor da Universidade da Califórnia, é um ativista muito ativo, né? Embora isso seja um pouco redundante, mas ele teve um papel importante na luta contra a ditadura nas Filipinas, né? Lutou contra a guerra nos Estados Unidos, né? E teve atuação em várias frentes de luta aí nessas décadas todas, né? Também teve aqui na América Latina, enfim, a gente vai falar sobre tudo isso aqui com ele nesse programa. E a gente quer começar... Quer falar alguma coisa antes, Rodolfo?
Lembrar que ele está aqui participando de um...
Está aqui participando, e eu queria agradecer aqui, né? Queria agradecer aqui o professor Jorge Romano, da Universidade Federal do ABC, né, que sempre nos apoia aqui no nosso programa, especialmente quando a gente trata aqui de questões internacionais. O Walden Bello é um sociólogo que tem uma visão bastante crítica da globalização e de todo o processo que a gente está vivendo. E eu vou começar, acho que... Fala.
Só lembrar que, bom, como vocês já devem ter percebido, a entrevista vai, apesar de a gente estar falando agora em português, a entrevista vai ser conduzida em inglês. Já aconteceu isso antes, então espero que não haja muito problema em acompanhar, mas de qualquer forma, depois no nosso site vai estar disponível a transcrição mais ampla e detalhada possível aí dessa conversa. A gente vai começar, não sei se tu quer fazer a primeira pergunta, mas a gente vai começar pela questão que movimentou os democratas de todo o mundo ontem, né, que foi a prisão de Assange. So, after this, we would like to start the interview with your views about the prison of Assange, or the treason against him from the new government of Ecuador.
Could you repeat that, please?
What are your views about the prison of Julian Assange?
Oh, yes. Well, I think that Julian Assange basically did the world a great favor by exposing, the sort of what goes behind the scenes in the decisions of the U.S. government and other governments and their intelligence services. WikiLeaks was a very, very important part in making governments and processes more transparent. And I think that the government of Ecuador unfortunately did a big mistake in ending his asylum within the embassy. I mean, they could have kept him there much longer, but I think that there was tremendous pressure from the British government as well as the U.S. government to get him out so that they could arrest him. So I would say that this is a big blow to movements demanding transparency, and I think that he is basically a martyr to the cause of greater transparency, good government, and more democracy in terms of the media and the press. So I think that he has done the world a great favor, just like Edward Snowden did the world a great favor, and I feel very sympathetic towards them because when I was much younger and I was studying what was happening in the Philippines, that I had to go and steal documents at the World Bank and exposed what the World Bank was doing, because we could not get any analysis or news about what they were doing unless we had to go and get the documents within the bank itself.
How do you do that?
And but this was back in the 1980s. We did not have the internet then. We had to go inside the bank. We posed as World Bank operatives. We post that we just seemed to come back from a mission. We had our ties were askew, and they asked for ID, and we would try to fumble. And they said, "Oh no, you're so tired. Go in." And once we got in there, we could, and we made a book based on 6,000 pages of confidential documents that exposed the relationship between the Marcos government and the World Bank and the U.S. government. And people said that the book was an underground bestseller in the Philippines during the Marcos dictatorship, and people said that it contributed to his downfall. Now, whether or not that was true, I'm not sure, but that's what people said. Then this was. The book came out in 1982, and Marcos' collapse fell in 1986. So without stealing documents, we would not have the world would not have known what was going on between the U.S., the World Bank, and Marcos.
So in a way, it's people's right to know what their governments are doing, even if the governments try to hide it from them.
Yes, I think that people have the right to know, and if government tries to keep things away from them, it is legitimate and morally right for people to be whistleblowers, to bring out documents, to steal documents, because the greater good is being aware, people being aware so that they can democratically exercise their choice. And corporations and governments, unfortunately, they love to be in the shadows and not present people with the full range of facts so that they can make informed choices about what to do, with respect to major decisions, that are occurring. So I would say that Julian Assange and Edward Snowden are really one of the two heroes of our times in terms of the interest of, public information, the people's right to know.
So you were very... You criticize a lot the globalization. Seems that globalization nowadays is not able to make growth, to make to distribute health. To make the world function in a little bit more justice. Why does this situation in globalization is so? What's the globalization is so bad nowadays, and how this situation has to do with the rise of the right, the far right, in so many places as we're seeing now?
Well, yes, back in the 1990s, you had, the rise of globalization, in which corporations were taking the lead in terms of breaking down barriers among countries, so that they would capital and goods would flow more easily, so that then there would be more profits for the corporations, and protection, in the form of trade barriers, investment barriers, and the flows of capital flows between countries. These were all seen as ancient, institutions that needed to be wiped away, and global economies should be more greatly integrated under, of course, global capitalism. And when we were opposing this in the 1990s, in our opposition to the structural adjustment of the World Bank, the IMF, the emergence of the WTO, people said, that we were what they call believers in a flat earth. That they said, oh, globalization is the wave of the future. You guys who are opposing globalization and standing for national economies that have the space to decide what to do for themselves, you belong to the past. And people like Thomas Friedman used to laugh at us. And then we had in 1998, we had the Asian financial crisis, which had been caused by the unrestricted flow of capital into the Asian economies. And then in 2008, we had the global financial crisis, which began in New York, spread to Europe, and Europe has not yet recovered from this, and the United States has had a very weak recovery. And what was seen then was that basically global finance, had created so many dislocations all throughout the world, and multinational corporations had created so much inequalities, including shipping so many of the jobs, for instance, in the north, in the Midwest of the United States from Europe, in search of cheap labor to developing countries like China and Mexico and other areas. And so what we saw was that when the Asian financial crisis exploded, then it was followed by the Seattle in 1999.
You have a whole...
Yes.
You have a whole... you have done much in this event in Seattle, don't you?
Yes, I was in Seattle, and I was one among a number of people who were very fortunate to help lead the event in Seattle, and then the global financial crisis. And here, globalization was not working. Globalization was creating inequalities. Globalization was deepening the problems of developing countries. Globalization was destroying workers' jobs in the United States and elsewhere. Globalization was creating tremendous crisis for the environment. So all the over the last 20 years, all that they said that globalization would bring about, which is less poverty, more growth, less inequality, have all been mistaken. And what we warned about, which is that there will be more crisis, more inequality, more global poverty, that is what has come about. And this is why now the project of globalization has created, is no longer seen as how you might call it, a legitimate project, that it is the cause of so many of the problems of people at this point. So you know, the critique of globalization came from the left. You know, it was people from the left, in the north as well as in the south, that attacked neoliberalism and globalization. The problem is, how come it has been the right wing that has benefited from this? How come? You know, so we start on the left, and then the right is the one who benefits. And this is the reason for this is that although the criticism of globalization came from the independent left, the mainstream left, the Social Democrats in Europe, the Labour Party in Great Britain, the Democratic Party in the United States, they were the ones who were also promoting neoliberal measures, globalization, and basically they were no longer listening to their working class base. And the working class base was very troubled by these measures. They felt that their living standards were falling down, but their parties, like the Labour Party in Great Britain, were only listening to the banks. You know, the Democratic Party leaders were only listening to Wall Street. And so what happened is the right-wing parties of the extreme right in Europe, like Marine Le Pen in France, you know, the Freedom Party in Austria, the Alternative for Deutschland in Germany, the Brexit people, they were the ones who began to speak to the problems of the workers. And so they were able to hijack the globalization critique and to begin to hijack the working class people away from the traditional workers' parties. So the problem here is, you know, that we in the left began the critique of globalization. We pointed out to what would happen, but the mainstream left, into which so many of the unions and the parties of the mainstream left in the United States and in Europe belonged to, had been co-opted by the corporations, by the globalization, and they were promoting the neoliberal measures. And so what happened was that they began to lose their base among workers. And this is, you know, the reason why we are now where we are at this point, whereby although the left started the critique of globalization, it's the right that has benefited because they were very smart. And they said they were listening to workers. They said that we're also for the welfare state. We want to preserve your wages. We're also for democracy. But the way they would put it is that we're all for this provided you are white, you are Christian, you belong to the dominant community, and you know, and these liberal elites are the ones who are flooding our countries with immigrants and taking away your jobs. So the right was very smart. They took some of these themes, anti-globalization themes of the left, these pro-democracy themes of the left, and then reformulated it in this toxic brew that said, yes, the welfare state, but only for whites. The welfare state, but only for those who are of the European stock. The welfare state, but not for the immigrants and the colored people. You know, so that's the way that the right was able to hijack and become the main spokesman of anti-globalization.
But the far right will not be able to solve all the problems of the globalization or the poverty and the inequality. The far right is going to fail to...
Yes, of course. Because the reason that they have taken all of this is because they're opportunists. They want to take the ordinary concerns of the people, but then they want to formulate it in this anti-immigrant, racist, and anti-people agenda. You know, so what's going to happen here is, you know, that so many of the people, you know, who are not white, who are migrants, who are not Christians, they will be left to the margins. And this will create even more polarization within, the society. And I think the important thing at this point in time is that the right-wing parties are going to create even more crisis at this point, because their program is very much exclusivist. It's an exclusivist program that does not respond, in fact, attacks, the marginalized groups in society, and basically what they want to create is a society in which a lot of people will have very few rights, and the rights will just be enjoyed by those of the right color or the right culture, so
or the right money,
or the right money, So this is the big corporations. Of course, they don't mind this. They can always adjust to that. But in response to your question, that's my explanation for why, although the criticism of globalization began on the left, the ones who benefited from it was the right, because it was a stupid mistake of the mainstream left and smart politics on the part of the right that enabled them to take these concerns but reformulate it,
twist them,
in a very toxic brew. The Americans have a saying for it, and I would say that it's like this: the lunch should have been the left, but the right ate the lunch of the left. Okay, so this is the paradox that occurred, at least in the global North.
And democracy will suffer with this also.
Of course, but again, as you can see, like in Europe, the Brexit people, Marine Le Pen, they have painted themselves as champions of democracy. Why? Because they say, oh, the European Union is such an impersonal thing. It's not accountable. And it's not. It's true. The European Parliament is so weak. And the real drivers, the European Commission and the technocrats. So the right wing, says that, look, this is not democracy. This is Euro dictatorship. So they played on that also, and put themselves up as Democrats. But again, the whole purpose is using democracy, using anti-globalization to create an exclusivist society based on culture and racism and class. So this is the sort of way that the right wing, the extreme right, has been able to ride on some of the concerns of the left, but reformulate it in a very toxic fashion that is anti-people, really. So, So the right is no solution. I think the right solution is simply more hatred that will emerge among countries, more inequality. And unfortunately, we have to find a way to be able to counter, this sort of very hateful formula that they're proposing at this point in time. But it's not going to be easy because in many countries, whether it's India or the Philippines or Thailand and many other places, many people from the middle class have bought into this sort of right-wing ideology. For instance, in the Philippines, the sense is, that the people, the drug users, are, who all, most of whom come from poor communities. The Duterte administration has portrayed them as the basic enemy of society, and many of the middle class feel, oh yes, they are the ones who threaten our integrity. And then in Thailand, the right wing and the military and elite people have basically said, if you allow the poorer classes to enjoy democracy, they will outnumber us. So we have to find ways to control them so that they do not destabilize create a society that harms our interests. And in India, the Hindu nationalists are basically saying, we have to have a society, that appeals, that promotes mainly the interests of the Hindu majority. And again, the middle class in India is being lured into this. So I think you also have the same problems in Brazil. That the middle class, under the spur of being incited by many of this right-wing people, have basically, have painted the Pété in the Pété period as the rise of the masses who are taking over your jobs now, and see what is happening. You now have them invading our spaces like the shopping malls, and they should not be there, and the airports. So we have class dynamics here. We have to bring this into any sort of understanding of this right-wing trend. So on the one hand, there is political formulas that are being used, and on the other hand, there are social classes that whose fears are being stimulated, and then of course there's the global corporate elite, the capitalists, who feel that left-wing governments and left-wing people should not be allowed to be in power because they will just restrict our capacity to make even more profits. And so we need people who will support neoliberalism. And if in the right here in the developing countries, if these people are evangelicals or they are fascists or what, it's much better than to have the left in power, because at least they will not harm our profits, and as long as they say there should be less government regulation, they're for it. So this is the sort of very dangerous coalitions that are being built, in which the elite sides with extreme right-wing populists and are propped up by a base of class hatred from the middle class.
Dangerous. Why do you say dangerous? And what's the danger?
Dangerous because they promote a culture of hatred. They promote a culture of hatred. Secondly, is they promote more authoritarian measures, because if democracy is going to be a tool by which poorer people, can promote their interests because they use democratic means, then these people become anti-democratic, and they will then support authoritarian measures that will gradually erode democratic foundations. And I think that although many of these people, like Duterte in the Philippines and Bolsonaro in Brazil, have come to power to elections, they also will be the first to dismantle, the protections, electoral practices, democratic practices, and recreate new systems that will be far less democratic. For instance, in Thailand, after the coup in 2014, the military has been there for 5 years, and they restructured the political system completely so that there is a Senate of 250 people that is going to be named, not elected, by the military. And this Senate says, okay, there's an assembly, National Assembly, which is elected, but anything that comes out of the National Assembly can be vetoed by the Senate, which is unelected. So they say this is important to safeguard the interests of people, whereas in fact they're just safeguarding the interests of the elite. You know, so they can restructure, and Thailand is a very interesting example. They can restructure democratic institutions so that they become far less democratic, and even if you have parliaments that that may be controlled by parties that popular parties, they can always be vetoed in terms of their programs. So and I think that we're going to see more and more of this. How do you so the problem of the right is, you know, okay, you can impose it through dictatorship, but maybe there are other ways in which you can institutionally reform a system to become less democratic and make it more sensitive to the interests of the elite and the middle classes.
But the goal of the far right is what? Is to divide the societies, is to make a kind of war. Is there a global plan for the right to act in all those? Is there a global articulation of the far right to do that in so many places?
Sure. I think many of the same trends and pressures created by globalization and neoliberalism created these reactions. And as I said, the failure of the mainstream left because it bought into globalization. You know, this was not part of a plan. This was part of the failure of the left, you know, to present itself with an agenda that's different from the corporate globalization. And what happened, therefore, is that many of the pressures that were created by this failure of the left, you know, the right took advantage of in so many countries, and they were able to become, you know, they were able to begin to elect governments to power, or you know. So I don't think, you know, there is a plan. I don't think there's a conspiracy. I'm just saying that the same sort of pressures occurring in different countries because of the thrust of corporate-driven globalization and the way people's parties from the mainstream left bought into it created a vacuum that the right wing in different countries took advantage of to paint themselves as the defenders of the people. So I don't think there's a global conspiracy, but it's the same responses to national crisis appearing in different countries that's created by the same forces, you know, the same structural forces, you know. But now that all of these people are coming up, you know, some of them are beginning to think, why don't we have a coordinated plan? Why don't we coordinate our plans? And Steve Bannon, you know, the former Trump advisor, is very active in trying to articulate this a right-wing extremist international, you know. So that I think is
in the beginning of this week or last week, there was a meeting in Europe of some of the far right parties in order to organize this articulation, no?
Yes, I think that, you know, that I would be surprised if they did not begin to move in that direction. And I think this is why it's important also for progressive parties, whether they are the mainstream left, whether they're social democrats, to begin to also work together, you know, to create a popular front. And because I think that they cannot afford to have fragmented responses to an increasingly coordinated right-wing international.
But this has been a historical weakness of the left. I mean, the right always seems to unite easily, while the left is always divided, discussing among itself.
Yes and no. I mean, in the 1930s, in the United States and in Europe in the 1930s, you did have the emergence of Popular Front governments, and a Popular Front against Nazism and fascism. The war against Hitler was really won by an alliance, of liberal democracies and the Soviet Union. So there are precedents for the left uniting, but I think it's now important, that there be the effort to go the extra mile to be able to unite and to try to get beyond, some of these differences, So it's rather urgent at this point in time. And our meeting in Itaipava this last week was an effort to try to get progressives from all over the world to begin to, can we find a way to work together more consciously so that we support each other's struggles against the rise of the right? So that's beginning to happen at this point in time, but it's not yet a critical mass. It should really involve more and more people, more and more movements, and really, we have to learn the lessons of the past. We have to understand why people have mobilized on the right, who should be, in fact, the base of the left. But unless we understand that, unless we understand that there have been mistakes that have been made, then unfortunately we might not be able to move forward.
What you said about the past, and we have to learn the lessons of the past. What's the difference between the far right in the past and the far right today? Because you fought against Marcos, we here fought against the dictatorship, and we have dictatorship in Chile and Argentina and so on. What's the difference between the far right at that time and today?
Well, during the dictatorships, I think that one was, these were dictatorships, that came to power by ending democracy, and whether it was Pinochet in Chile, the Brazilian dictatorship, the Argentine dictatorship. These were, sort of the military coming in and, saying, enough of the social disorder, enough of civilian politics, and basically saying that whether the left civilian politics or the right wing or the center, they were all creating disorder, and boom, and therefore we imposed this situation.
We have the Cold War at that time.
Right. There was also the Cold War, and of course the United States would support anybody that was against the Soviet Union. But now I think the big difference is that the right-wing forces are coming to power through elections. And they have a very active base, again, a base that's created by these political formulas that
different from fascism and Nazism.
They have similarities to what happened in the 1930s in Europe, because basically the Nazis in Germany came to power. They have similarities to what happened in the 1930s in Europe, because basically the Nazis in Germany came to power to elections, and once they were there, they never gave up the power, and so there are similarities to that period. In which basically they have a base that a mass base that they use, and through elections they come to power. And I think there is a similarity in that once they get into power, it's hard to get them out. Now, when you ask me about Marcos and the dictatorships in the third world, during the 1970s and 1980s. I think these were these were military dictatorships that had a small social base. It was mainly the elites, and in many cases, the middle class eventually, like in Thailand in 1992 and in the Philippines in 1986, the middle class became a democratizing force because it was opposed to this dictatorship that was had a very narrow base in the elites. So I think that's the difference today. That then you had golpes, military regimes. They were socially isolated, but now what you have is right-wing regimes that come to power with popular support from the middle classes, and once there, then they make the system more authoritarian. And in that way, they are similar to, say, the Nazis in the 1932 elections, who were then, through democratic means, were asked to form a government. And once they formed the government, they just unleashed their terror on society. So I think there is that kind of similarity that we face today, you see this now in the Philippines, whereby once he got to power, Duterte started killing people. And he said they were all drug users. These are his anti-crime campaign. Yes, the main problem in the society is the drug users. And now he has killed, according to some estimates, 20,000 people. And he's popular. He's very popular. He's 80% popular because he has managed to convince people that the big enemy is the drug users. They are not human beings. So don't worry if I kill them off. Democracy can be an enabler of authoritarianism. And people ask us all the time, me and others, if Duterte is so bad that he has killed all of these people, why is he so popular? And that's the problem. That maybe, hopefully in the end, we will be able to convince people that his program of killing drug users is not the way to go. But we have we have a big job to do that. Because he has been able to formulate the enemy as the people of the Philippines versus the drug cartels and the drug users, and that's been what has kept him there with an 80% approval rating after 3 years.
He has been praised by Bolsonaro.
Oh yeah. I mean, I can imagine that he would be praised by Bolsonaro because. In many ways, Duterte and Bolsonaro are, of the same cloth. They prefer, authoritarian means of governance, and for Bolsonaro, democracy allows parties like the PT to come to power, I think he has made it clear. To Brazilians that he would prefer a more authoritarian kind of system, much like what existed in 1964 with the Brazilian military dictatorship, although I hear that the Brazilian military becomes uncomfortable when Bolsonaro says that we need to bring back that system or something like that. So anyway, I think we should not underestimate the ability of these figures to create a base of popular support and feeling that they then use to push their programs that are quite repressive, that marginalize people, that hurt significant sectors of the community, and even lead to mass massacres, such as in India, in Gujarat in 2002, whereby the Prime Minister, who was then Chief Minister of the state of Gujarat, was one of the people who planned the massacres, and this now is the government in India. So I guess what we really need to look at then is fascism can be popular, because we've been told that fascism is dictatorship. But the reality is that fascism can be popular. And what is the history that we need to borrow from the Second World, from that period in the 1930s and 1940s, is that fascism in power can create a mass base that can make it live for a long time. So
even if the economy goes bad?
Well, Franco's Spain, he was there for over 30 years. Salazar was in Portugal for about 40 years. Hitler was popular until he committed suicide. Not even the bombing. I mean, this is what is so interesting. Not even the massive bombing of Germany, the civilian population suffering all of this, that did not break the loyalty of the massive majority of German people to Hitler. And that's one, and we really need to realize this, that, the main thing that maintained Hitler in power, yes, coercion was there, violence was there, but the consensus that he was able to create among large parts of German society, that he was leading them to a new era where they would enjoy racial superiority, I think that was the central factor that kept him in power for a long time. And, and I think it's good that after the war, the new generation of Germans really felt that they had to uproot the Nazi ideology that even their parents suffered from. And to say that genocide occurred and to institutionalize anti-genocidal, the Holocaust and all of that, to remind people that never again should they permit this sort of thing. I guess my point is that the worst thing about fascist regimes is that they have a popular base. And we must not underestimate their capabilities of doing that, because compared to a fascist regime, a military dictatorship is quite weak because it has no legitimacy. It's only there by the force of arms, and sooner or later, the people will rise up against it and destroy it. But a fascist regime has a mass base, and that mass base can keep it there for a long time. And I think that's the very big danger in the Philippines. That's a very big danger in many other, countries. And oftentimes, and I've said this several times, the middle class is that mass base of fascism or extremist regimes. So, these are. I think we should listen to history and go back to many of the things that happened in the 20th century. Because unless we absorb the lessons of what happened in many times in places like Germany in the 20th century and others, even in Latin America in the 1970s, we might repeat the mistakes of the past. I say Latin America in the 1970s because I did my PhD dissertation on the counter-revolution in Chile. And the mass base of the counter-revolution was the middle class. They were out there. These were people that felt that the Unidad Popular was the work of the devil, and despite the fact that they enjoyed many of the advances in terms of better living conditions in the first year of the Unidad Popular, this same middle class that the UP said, oh, they'll come to our side, was the one that turned against Allende and formed a mass base that invited the military to come in. And this is the sad fact about the writing about Allende, because many of the left interpretations of Allende in Latin America as well as in the United States basically say, oh, this was just engineered by the CIA. You know, so it's the CIA and the military, they were the ones who worked together to get Allende out. No, this is a big, big mistake. It was the elites and the middle class that created the situation whereby the U.S. and the military could work in order to overthrow Allende. So, so I think these are, we should be very careful even in the way that we interpret historical events, because it can make us forget things that were really very central in terms of historical tragedies, like the 1973 coup against Allende that then created 17 years for neoliberalism to flourish in Chile. And until now, unfortunately, neoliberalism, despite the fact that Pinochet is gone, neoliberalism is so deeply embedded in Chile because of what happened those 17 years where the Chicago boys ruled. And of course, you have Mr. Guesde right here, who was working in Chile during that period. He's a Chicago boy, and I think he wants to recreate that kind of neoliberal society here under Bolsonaro.
Yeah, one example is the Social Security reform.
Yeah, I mean these are all classical neoliberal measures, and you know, so you know, these are what happened in Chile is very much connected to what's happening in Brazil with Mr. Guesde, or how do you pronounce his name?
Guedes.
Guedes, you know, Paulo Guedes, okay, you know, because he's a direct link to the Pinochet period.
And how did the middle class end up in such a
mess?
In such a mess. It's a fear of losing, losing power. Why the middle class act like this?
Because I think there is a feeling that when the poorer people begin to enjoy more purchasing power, that they then begin to act like the middle class, and the middle class feels threatened by the rise of the poor people because they think that they are rising at their expense. And so I just heard here, but I was not surprised when I heard all about the incidents at the malls, where they basically said, "Oh my God, this is." The black people are invading the malls, and they're now at the airports. How come they're now traveling by air? So there is this sense that their status, because it's so fragile, their status or their sense of themselves is tied up to the fact that at least their life is better than the poor. You know, when the poor begins to rise, and I think they begin to feel this very strong fear that their own status is being eroded, so that it leads them to alliances with the right. And of course, usually the right is very smart, okay, and it says, "Hey, come on over." And in Chile, the middle class party was the Christian Democratic Party, and they said the right wing was very smart. They said, "Oh, the Christian Democrats can lead the coalition. The people in the slates that we will put up against the Unidad Popular, they can come from the Christian Democrats. Now, we in the National Party, will not contest." So, the right can be very smart and allow the middle class to be the face of the counter-revolution, but in the end, the middle class is the one that suffers under the neoliberal measures that the right wing introduces. So it's you saw this happen in Chile, that finally the middle class woke up that the Pinochet neoliberal reforms had destroyed their status, and they became part of the concertación that eventually ejected Pinochet from power. But, you know, so these are the things we need to look at when it comes to the our history in our continent, in Latin America. Of course, it's not something that is alien to Brazil. We saw the middle class mobilize against Lula, against the PT in the recent elections. But you also had this in 1964 against Goulart, you know. You had, you know, the same kind of, middle class women being on the front lines, you know, and then people in, during the Allende in 1973, you had the same sort of putting women on the front lines with pots and pans. And people said, oh, that's what happened in Brazil in 1964. You know, so there are all these things that we need to learn from.
And is there a difference between the right wing in Latin America and in the South that are very linked to the neoliberalism reforms and the right in the North? Is there a difference between Duterte?
As of now. As of now, there is a difference when it comes to the embrace of neoliberalism, because with Bolsonaro and with Duterte and with the Thai military, they have neoliberal programs. You know, they have not broken with neoliberal programs. And Duterte, for instance, his program is neoliberal. He's not questioning it at all. Although it is a failed program, he is continuing, and he says that the reason he has to continue this is because his economic advisors, who are all technocrats, feel that it is right, and he says, I don't understand economics, so I will let them do it. You know, but in the North, because of their opportunistic politics to win over the working class, many of the right has become anti-globalization, and in many cases anti-neoliberal. And basically they've said, yes, the welfare state, but again, as I said earlier, the welfare state, but only for the dominant stock of people, only for whites, only for Christians, only for those of us who have been here a long time. You know, this is the same thing that you find in the U.S. Now, in the U.S., this is again, this idea that what we have in this society must be enjoyed only by real Americans. So when you press them in this, the real Americans are Anglo-Saxons, Protestants, yes, Catholics too, but certainly not Latinos, not blacks. Okay, then maybe Asians, as long as they behave well. But that's the real American discourse. If you press them on it, that's what they mean. Of course, in politics in the U.S. and others, people have to speak coded language. So when they say real Americans, they really are referring to this dominantly white population, and so that's the and then there are
days of the founding fathers.
Right, and then there are the fake Americans, so they have to have this coded language so that they don't appear too anti-democratic and racist, but in fact they're racist,
So in this scenario, what are the chances of the Democrats or the left?
Oh, I think we have our work cut out for us in terms of understanding the dynamics of extremists of the far right, in terms of working out our differences among the left, and getting unity above doctrinal struggles. We have to figure out how to relate to the middle class. We have to find out how we can make use of the contradictions within governments, so that we can prevent a monolithic front by the state. We need to be able to have a narrative, that allows different sectors of society to realize that their future is really in progressive democracy in the future. And we have to get people to realize that we're not asking for a return to the old elite democracy, whereby, yes, it was liberal in form, but very elitist, and it just provided a framework for the accumulation of wealth by the 1%, and left most of the other people without poorer. So that kind of progressive, social, democratic alternative is something that we must really work on, because, like in the Philippines, for instance, if what you're going to say is that, oh, we'll just go back to the democracy of the last 30 years, where nothing happened except more poverty, it's not going to work. I mean, people will just tell us, it didn't work. It was so hypocritical. You talk about human rights, but you cannot eat human rights. These are, that's the answer you will get. So we have to have a winning narrative that brings equality right into the center of the democratic project. So can we do it? Yes, I'm confident we can do it. But nothing is guaranteed. If we don't do it right, we might be headed for failures, and history is not kind to those who screw up, and because you could end up with a 40 years of dictatorship of a right-wing fascist regime like Franco in Spain. Now these are the kinds of outcomes. There is nothing guaranteed. It really all depends on how we, as progressives, can get beyond our differences and create a new narrative and have a politics of popular front that wins over people to our side, even as we neutralize the agencies of the state, that all have this repressive and fascistic tendencies. So it's not an easy task, but am I confident? Yes, I am confident we can do it.
In the past, you're talking about fascists and Nazis. All this ended up in a war, in a global war. You believe that we are facing this kind of risk, or the world is so different right now that we can imagine a global conflict like we have in 2 world wars?
No, anything is possible at this point in time. I think that this conflict between China and the United States, can end up with, a major, conflict, so the thing is that things can have a life of their own once you have a kind of competition that on the economic front. This can lead to military competition, which can then run out of control, and I think, and then this creates alliances among, you know, one group versus another, you know. So certainly that is a possibility. But you also have to realize here, the other side of that equation is that fascists came to power in Europe, okay? But it was only a global war that took them out. You know, without the Second World War, the fascists would have overrun Europe and the Pacific. You know, so I'm just raising this, that sometimes, you know, sometimes fascists cannot be taken out unless there is a global conflict. Okay, now. So the danger is both ways. In other words, that the fights against extremism can lead to global war, and global war. Without global war, they can't be taken out of power. So I'm just saying that these are all the possibilities. But the important thing, and I would just like to reiterate this, is to make sure that the extreme right does not come to power in the first place. Because once you give them a foothold in power, they will just destroy, democracy. Of course, I'm saying that it has to be done through democratic means, but we must outmaneuver them democratically, of course.
We are facing the first 100 years of Bolsonaro. Excuse me, 100 days? No. And his popularity is going down.
Yeah.
And many people say the kind of people Bolsonaro, it's very unusual. Even between the right, he's a very far right. What's your impression about his government so far in this first 100 days?
Well, I'm not a Brazil expert, but certainly people feel that he does not. He lacks many of the skills that even right-wing folks need to be able to push their programs. And as I understand it, he has created a lot of tensions with, and what's his name again?
Guedes.
He and Guedes, in their push for the, this social security reform, have created a lot of tensions with the Senate and the House of Representatives here, with the Parliament. And
the elite who support him is now...
Yeah, so basically I think, my sense is, again, I'm not a Brazil expert, but that if he doesn't learn these skills very fast, then that coalition could fall apart. What would happen? Who will step into that vacuum? Will the traditional center-right parties recover because of that? Or will there be a recovery of PT so that it is no longer isolated but leads the reconfiguration of the democratic forces? So that's a possibility that's there. But there is also the possibility that many of the coalition people that now form this coalition might say, okay, we have to reconfigure the relations among us, maybe make him more of a figurehead, and him more, other people taking, seem more rational and not as radical at first, but strategically, let's talk about the program of the right. Let's implement this more carefully and more slowly rather than pushing right away. So you can have those pragmatic kind of adjustments But I don't think we should. I don't think that we should rely on the right wing's this articulation as a mechanism, but rely more on getting the progressive movement again together and fighting out of depression, because it seems like up till now there's a great deal of depression among progressives. And how does one? What is the right campaign? Is Free Lula the main campaign? Who are the new political figures? Is there going to be an important reform of the left here? So these are the questions that I think progressives here have to wrestle with at this point in time. But certainly, what I fully agree with is that it's time to get out of the depression, and because the longer we are depressed, the more, just like a human being, the more you let depression take hold, the longer it stays with you, and that's also one of the things we in the Philippines have. We were in shock for some time at how come this happened, and we were one surprise after another. But I feel that after 3 years, we're in a better state psychologically than, say, we were when Duterte first came to power. But we're still far from being a great united force that can confront him. Our elections are coming up on May 11. And the big danger is that Duterte has such a popular hold, and the people in the running for the Senate, from Duterte's coalition, have basically said just one thing: elect us because we will finish the Duterte revolution. And there's no program, there's nothing. Many of them are corrupt. Even the daughter of the president said it's not important to be honest to be elected. But they say, but they're all for my father, and vote for them because they will continue the changes that my father has brought to the country. And the big danger is that many or most of the people of the administration slate might win this midterm election, and it may take some time, that before we can, put together a winning coalition So we're still in the Philippines. We're still very much on the defensive. Although I think that we have. Gone from the face of depression, and now we're in a state of panic.
Wow.
But, societies and forces are manic depressive. That we're now at that stage of mania.
And how about
alarm?
How about Trump? Isn't the situation of the United States very important to the outcome of all this?
No, definitely. And I think, as we were saying earlier, the progressive forces in the United States have become much more invigorated by Trump. And as you can see, there are so many people in the Democratic Party that want to run against Trump because they feel that, they have the chance to beat him because he's so unpopular. And, so I think the big issue in the U.S. at this point is, do you want more radical figure who promises real change to be the one to run against Trump, or do you want a more mainstream figure that can appeal to the majority of white people in the center, not like to threaten them, you know. So that is the big debate at this point in the U.S. And as I was telling earlier, the strategy of the Republicans is to paint the Democratic Party as being under the control of the young, more radical members of the Democratic Party in Congress, like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. And Trump's son, 3 weeks ago, he was leading a chant that was quite vulgar, in which he was leading it, with the Republican crowd. AOC sucks, AOC sucks, and this is not something that you do say in a mass rally. And then a week later, Trump came up and in a Republican gathering, he said, the people, that I am running against people like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. These are the radicals. She's a 29-year-old bartender, and the senators in the Democratic Party are controlled by this woman. They're petrified by her, and she has this Green New Deal that will make you all poor. And so the way that Trump is trying his scare tactics by painting this young, the progressive Democrat, as saying that this is the heart and soul of the Democratic Party, and she's going to push a program that will make the American middle class poor, because they will take you, they will tax you, so that they have this Green New Deal and that sort of thing. So the strategy of Trump and the others is to say, that we're really against what threatens us is not people like Joe Biden and all of this, but these radicals in Congress that will dictate what the older Democrats, Joe Biden, etc., are going to do. So those are the issues that are emerging now, and it's less than, it's a year and a half before the U.S. elections. And so, on the one hand, yes, a reinvigorated Democratic Party, but on the other hand, who will win the definition of the situation? Will it be Trump, or will it be, the Democrats? And who among the Democrats is going to emerge as the one who will confront Trump and will possibly have the greater chance of winning? So all of that is up in the air at this point. And as you said, so much depends on what happens in the United States. And of course, in other parts of the North, the big question in Germany is, will they be able to stop the momentum of the Alternative for Deutschland that now controls 90% of the, not 90%, but they have about 90 seats in the 600-seat Bundestag, which is a big, big leap into, and will Marine Le Pen be stopped from becoming president in, when is this now, 2022 or 2023. My worry is that she probably, I had, when I first saw Macron, his policies, I thought that he might just be a stepping stone to Le Pen eventually winning. And of course, we don't know what will happen in Great Britain. Maybe the Brexit will in fact be, will break Great Britain. Everything is, is up in the air. At this point in time, whenever you talk to anybody from England, they don't know what's going to happen. And, so it might split into two countries. No, I'm just kidding.
Acho que... Okay, so I think we are coming to an end of this interview.
Sure.
We'd like to thank you very much, but before that, we would like to to have your message for our viewers, of our people that are with us in the internet.
Well, yes, I think...
You said before that you believe in a chance of
yes,
the world getting better.
Sure. I mean, I think that we have been, we've had two big surprises over the last 30 years. The first big surprise was the collapse of the Berlin Wall and the collapse of socialism in Europe. The second big surprise is between 2010 and 2019, the rise of the right in the North as well as in the global South. And my sense is, so long as we absorb the lessons of what created the rise of the right, if we, in the progressive movement, realize that that the right wing was able to appropriate the critique of globalization, because part of the problem was the mainstream left, the Social Democrats, became identified with globalization, became identified with the European Union and technocracy. That these are lessons that we really need to learn from in terms of articulating a program that will really advance the cause of progressive democracy and most of the population. And I think one of the things that we really need to do is, it's very important for us to be able to have a new narrative about democracy, one in which we put equality at the center, and that it is not seen that we're just fighting for all democratic liberties. We're not just fighting for due process. We're not just fighting for elections, and we're not just fighting for the traditional freedoms that are associated with democracy, but that we're fighting for a democracy that really delivers for the interests of the people, of the poor, that ends this scandalous global inequality, that in fact poses a massive attack on global poverty, and that promotes diversity and brings people up instead of brings them down. So I think that discourse, a new democratic discourse, a new democratic narrative, is very important. So it must be a narrative that can give hope again, and hope to those who are oppressed, and hope to those to people now in a great degree of confusion as to where the world is headed, and hope to those who become skeptical, hope to those who have become cynical, and hope to those who basically have said, oh my God, the fascism or authoritarianism is the way of the future, and have resigned themselves to that. So I think that is, it's a big challenge. And we need to work on it, okay? And there is no guarantee of success. The only guarantee is that nothing is won without a struggle.
Great. Eleonora?
Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Nós queremos agradecer também a sua participação aqui com a gente, dizendo que essa entrevista a gente vai procurar fazer a tradução, transcrevê-la, vai estar disponível no nosso site. Várias pessoas aqui, entre o pessoal que acompanhou, até se prontificaram a ajudar nisso. Acho que isso é importante. A gente vai procurar conversar com quem falou disso aqui durante a conversa. E, enfim, essa entrevista fica disponível no nosso canal de vídeo, youtube.com/c/Eleonora e Rodolfo Lucena, TUTAMÉIA, o TUTAMÉIA escrito com letras maiúsculas. E ficará disponível, como eu disse, a transcrição, a reportagem, mais informações sobre o trabalho e a história do Walden no nosso site tutameia.jor.br. Tutameia é o... Estou vendo aqui o título do livro do Guimarães Rosa, não é isso?
Isso nos inspira aqui.
Que que é grande, it's a great Brazilian writer.
Okay.
It's who inspired us to have the title, the name of our.
And what does tutameia mean?
Yeah,
Almost nothing.
Almost nothing.
Almost nothing.
Almost nothing.
Okay.
Very small thing.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah.
So.
Okay.
Então é isso, pessoal. Muito obrigado. Vamos que vamos, hein?
Tchau, pessoal. Até amanhã.